Tonight, we're going in depth on the story the entire world is watching closely. About 30 minutes ago, President Trump announced a 2-week ceasefire deal with Iran, but only if Iran agrees to the, quote, immediate and safe opening of the Strait of Hormuz. That seems to suggest at this point Iran has not yet agreed to it. We've talked about Iran, though, shutting down the Strait of Hormuz, this really key waterway controlled by Iran, where tankers from all over the world pick up oil and other key commodities to ship it to other parts of the world. It carries about 20% of the world's energy needs, and that's affecting global oil supply and ultimately our gas prices here in the U.S., shooting up about $1. Last week, during President Trump's primetime address to the American people, it sounded as if the president had dropped his demand for Iran to open the strait, saying it was time for our European allies to step in instead. Take a listen.
So to those countries that can't get fuel, many of which refuse to get involved in the decapitation of Iran, we had to do it ourselves. I have a suggestion. Number one, buy oil from the United States of America. We have plenty. We have so much. And number two, build up some delayed courage. Should have done it before, should have done it with us, as we asked. Go to the strait and just take it, protect it, use it for yourselves.
But then this weekend, we saw a profanity-laced post by the president, clearly bringing that demand to reopen the strait back. He said, quote, and I can only say part of this, open the strait or you will be living in hell. Just watch. Then yesterday, on the eve of his deadline, he made the threat more specific.
Because of the power of our military, where every bridge in Iran will be decimated, where every power plant in Iran will be out of business, burning, exploding, and never to be used again.
And joining us now to discuss is Dan Schneiderman, Director of Global Policy Programs at Penn Washington. So what do you make of President Trump's message today, warning that Iran's whole civilization will die tonight if a deal is not reached?
Look, first, thanks for having me on today. I'm very concerned that this means an escalation of attacks on civilian infrastructure. And there are certainly dual-use targets like certain power sources or certain bridges that could be a part of military infrastructure that civilians use. But I think this is clear that the administration means to escalate the military attacks on civilian infrastructure inside of Iran. I can't imagine anything else.
And how do you think Iran will respond?
Look, I think the Iranians have made clear that they have the capability and the willingness to go and hit energy infrastructure across the Gulf. And that has major geopolitical implications. It has major economic implications. And so I would expect that the Iranians will actively target things like Saudi's oil infrastructure.
What do you think Iran has learned about the power of its control over the Strait of Hormuz?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Iranians understand that they're fighting an asymmetric war on a different battlefield. The United States and Israel were always going to be able to win a conventional conflict with Iran. We have conventional superiority over the Iranians in many, many ways, and that's been proven. I mean, leave aside what happened with the U.S. air assets that were shot down recently. We have generally established air dominance in Iran, which means we can operate with a certain degree of impunity. But the Iranians have one thing that the United States can't do anything about, and that's geography. They're able to menace the strait with drones and cruise missiles that can be fired off of the back of trucks. And so it's very hard to simply take away the threat. And when you combine that with the mines they've been able to lay in the straits, functionally, that means that the Iranians have a certain amount of control over the Straits of Hormuz. And so what I think the Iranians understood is this is always the way that they were going to be able to have an asymmetric advantage on the battlefield and to choose the way in which they would influence the conflict, right? And if you draw back to Clausewitz and you think about the way that war and strategy is supposed to be laid out, war is politics by other means. And so the Iranians very clearly understand that affecting the global economy affects the political decision-making of its adversaries.
Does Iran negotiate this way? Will it be threatened into making a deal?
You know, look, I think if anything, the Iranians have proven very clearly that their number one goal, success for them, is survival. And so in that sense, unless you are fundamentally talking about wholesale governmental change, which would require, I think, land forces and a political commitment that the United States and Israel are not prepared to make in terms of the amount of time and effort that would be required, you're not going to change the government. And so in that sense, it's hard for me to imagine a scenario in which fundamentally you have a wholesale change in government. The question is there something that the Americans can do that would allow them to declare victory and stop the conflict, right? And now you have also, on the other hand, I think Gulf states in particular, but also states across the Middle East that are saying you can't leave us with a wounded Iran and a closed strait, because that's a strategic outcome we can't tolerate. And this is also, I think, part of the reason why you've seen the shift in the White House's rhetoric on this question over the last few days.
President Trump has said that decades of diplomacy with Iran and this really brutal regime just has not worked. So is military force a possible solution?
You know, I think it's sort of unfair to characterize it that way. I would say that the JCPOA, the nuclear deal with Iran, was working. And I would say that the U.S. government was saying that even during the first Trump administration. So to me, I think we'll never know whether or not the nuclear deal would have borne out an improvement in diplomatic relations with Iran or not. What I don't think you can argue is that there is not a military solution that will ultimately change facts on the ground in the long run, because I think the Iranian regime is incredibly durable. And like I said, the cost of ground forces invading Iran and a ground war in the Middle East is incredibly high. And this is why I think ultimately it's always better to try to find a negotiated solution, even with your worst adversaries, than to go into a grinding war, because the political implications, the cost to human life and to the global economy are so severe that if you can find a diplomatic an agreement with even your worst enemy, I think it's worth trying.
All right, and on that note here, Matt Delushian in the Live Center just got some new information while that interview was playing for you right there. Iran's Supreme National Security Council says that it has accepted a 2-week ceasefire in the war. So we told you about a half hour ago that President Trump has halted attacking Iran and annihilating the country for a 2-week period because of the Strait of Hormuz, and telling them that they need to open that. In a statement, Iran said that it would negotiate with the United States in Islamabad beginning on Friday. It said that this does not signify a termination of the war. They say our hands remain upon the trigger, and should the slightest error be committed by the enemy, it shall be met with full force. So there was a 10-point plan that was submitted to the American side through Pakistan, which emphasizes key points here, such as controlled passage through the Strait of Hormuz, coordinated with Iran's armed forces. So again, the negotiations should begin on Friday. But Lena, that is the latest information that we're getting here in this back and forth situation.
Yeah. A major update. Regulated passage under the coordination of the armed forces of Iran. What will that look like? All right. Thank you so much, Matt. Obviously, we will be closely following this over the coming hours and the coming days, so stay with us here on NBC. If there's a topic, by the way, or an issue that you want us to cover here on Depth, we would love to hear your suggestions, please. You can scan the QR code right there. You can also find me on social media at Lena Tillett News.